Hey, want to hear a funny joke? Teacher does a painting demo for 30 minutes. Turns out the microphone was on mute the whole time. None of the audio picked up. It's not very funny, is it? How is everyone? We're going to continue on with our real simple vintage paintings with layer 2. Our process for layer 2 is going to differ from that of our process for layer 1. Layer 1 was conducted as wet on wet. We pre-wet the entire surface and painted that surface while it was still active, and that enabled us to have an energetic first layer and kinetic and very luminous. Your job with layer 2 is to preserve all of that and work selectively, and layer 2 is done wet on dry. The purpose for wet on dry is to give you more control and to enhance some of the sculpture and lighting that is present in our photo reference but not yet in our painting. Predominantly I'm going to do layer 2 with the same color that I had done for layer 1. So you can see here I'm just adding to the amount of pigment that I have to work with. It's still the alizarin crimson and cadmium red combination from layer 1. There are different strategies for layering. For our purpose here, we want to firmly establish the reds and work with the same type of luminosity and water pigment balance that we had in layer 1 for layer 2. And when I apply the paint on wet on dry for this second layer, I am going to work carefully, and again, it's on a dry surface, so it's wet pigment applied to a dry surface. I'm trying to establish the more concrete shapes that I see here in the reflections. The more reflective a surface is, the faster the transitions between light, middle, and dark are. And there are some sections on here where the lighting is softer and we roll from mid-tone into shadow, or even from highlight into mid-tone. And then there are other areas where it's more abrupt, such as where I'm painting here. So I'm trying to maintain that lighter corner on the edge of the body of the foam, and the best way to do that is through wet on dry. So essentially establishing an outer edge of the shape first and then filling it in with the pigment, but taking great care to not do too much with the brush. I'm passing over any given area just once because I have to be careful not to end up disrupting the lower layer. If I activate the bottom layer of paint, it'll mix and I'll lose all of the energy that I had before. If you have a proper balance between water and pigment, even as you're applying the second layer, you should be able to see through it to that first layer and the energy that you established on layer 1. The paint and the water, the pigment and water balance should be such that you're applying translucent layers. What we've actually got here reflected on the side of the phone is the cord. So when I'm applying the paint on the side, I want to think about the form of the cord in its natural state, but also how it's distorted because of the side plane of the phone body. So I'm kind of indicating the idea that there are different coils and springs, but I don't want to lose sight of the overall cylindrical quality of that cord. So you can see me first noting the individual springs, but then kind of tying it together in the cylindrical form and having it pulled down the side of the front of the phone once again to indicate that distortion. All of the highlights and shadows that you see in these telephones are a product of something. So as you're painting, you have to determine not only how light or dark the area that you're working in is, but also what's causing that. For this phone, it's lighter on the bottom. It's reflecting that white because that's the white of the table that it's set upon. And the darker areas that are above those highlights, that's the background. So that's why in this phone in particular, and you may notice this on the phone that you're painting, the bottom is reflecting light because they're set on white surfaces, and the upper portions tend to be a little bit darker. Now as we move towards the earpiece of the receiver, I have to remember that this is akin to both a sphere and a cone. So I want to indicate that the the lighting is wrapping around this form similar to the way it would in a cone, like the verticality, but also the way that it would on a sphere, where it's really emphasizing that rounded quality. So working wet on dry to capture the more rapid lighting changes, but also wanting to show the seams of where the plastic is joined together. So the seam has a deep shadow, but the almost lip of the plastic, it keeps a little bit of a highlight. So right here I'm trying to account for both the shadow that is indicating the depth of the seam, but also the highlight that shows that the top lip of the bottom piece of plastic is catching the light. Now even though you're dealing with the same color here, you can get different variations of light and dark just by varying the amount of water that you put down. At various points, sometimes I'm applying more dense pigment and then softening it with just a wet brush. If here on the side, I think I've applied a little bit too heavy and sharp of an edge, so I'm going back in with just a wet brush or a damp brush over, like, adjacent to it, so that some of that pigment that is already positioned to the right will seep out towards the left. And I use the word seep because it's a more gradual process, so it's a softer transition and not so sharp as you would find with wet on dry. Now as I move to the handle portion of the receiver, really thinking of this as a rectangle. And when you think of a rectangle, you know that there are stark differences between planes to show light and dark. But it's not so simple as the shapes that we painted on our warm-up painting, because that had like a razor sharp edge. This has a little bit more of a rounded quality, so the corner actually is picking up a highlight. So I don't actually want my shadow and highlight, or shadow and midtone to touch. There's a little bit of a distance between them, and you'll see that in the photo reference and as the painting progresses. And there are moments as it goes down towards the hook on the body of the phone that it rolls into shadow. So those are areas right here you can see that I'm applying a wet brush with just water to help to soften that transition. And there are other points where I'll want it to be a little bit more dense. So typically we begin the process wet on dry, sometimes leave those wet on dry edges so that they're really sharp, and then other times softening and having them flow into layer one. As we move to the mouthpiece on the receiver, there are a couple areas here that are slightly lighter. There are two light kind of vertical highlights that I'm adding in now. I had applied pigment all throughout the kind of bell of the bottom of the phone, but then realized that they had to be lighter. So what I'm doing here is taking, right here I'm drying it off a little bit. Just it's called a thirsty brush. You dry it on the paper and then just touch the dry thirsty brush to the surface. It'll absorb up the pigment and the water, but it won't disturb your lower layers. Before I could do that, I had to take water from the cup and just place it onto the surface, and that depositing of water repels the pigment out to the sides. So that's how I was able to reclaim the highlight. This is a great shadow because it's so geometric and triangular. If you really start to think only in terms of simple shape, or not only in terms, but if you start to think in terms of simple shape, then the process of painting the phone becomes much more possible. It's less intimidating. If you just look at the phone as a complex form, which it is, it can be overwhelming. But if you boil it down into its components, where you have triangular shadows and highlights, or rectangular highlights, and simple shapes that are comprising the phone, like a prism for the body of the phone, a cylinder squashed down as the dial, etc., things become a lot more manageable. I always say in the drawing classes that if you could draw a circle, a rectangle, and a triangle, then you could draw anything. Because if you can understand how to skew and arrange those shapes, that's all really drawing is. The same is for painting, in terms of application, perhaps. You're still looking for shape. As I apply lighting to the cord here, I want to remember that the individual coils or springs of the cord are casting light and shadow, but overall, the greater picture of this cord is that it's a cylinder that's wrapping around in space. So I have to kind of represent both of those things, that the cylinder would be impacted by light rolling around it, so rolling from light to midtone to shadow, but also the fact that there are these pockets of shadow within it. The beautiful thing about the objects that we're painting is that they have a history. They're from a time gone by. In this case, all of these phones are from the 1960s, but this was a design that was a mainstay in American homes for probably almost 30 years. These phones kind of became prominent, or they evolved into this design in the 1960s, and they were around until probably the early 90s. And the dial changed. They became a keypad eventually for like a touch-tone phone. But when you really start to try to connect with the world that these came from and the fact that they have a history, that's your job as artists, to uncover the story and find the beauty within the subject that you're painting. Because it could be a person, it could be an object. There's always history. It could be man-made, it could be nature, but how do you point something out to the audience or to the viewer that they otherwise wouldn't have noticed? It's one of your jobs as an artist to not only recreate but also offer some sort of commentary. And maybe in looking at this painting of a phone, you wouldn't notice any sort of story or narrative, but we're trying to invoke these objects in these paintings with a type of appeal and a liveliness. So instead of this phone like rotting in an antique shop and collecting dust, or not even in an antique shop, maybe a basement, we're with our first layer with wet on wet and that kinetic background energy, we're bringing it back to life. Now, I wonder what we'll end up thinking of the sleek devices that we have now, the smartphones and the tablets. If you study design and you think even in terms of fonts, sans serif fonts, and how bold and slick and modern and striking they are, all of our modern devices have symbolic meaning behind what they're trying to communicate, from the color to the rounded corners. It's all ergonomic design, and it's how it makes you feel. They're portals, they're windows into this endless digital world. But I wonder if these were all rediscovered 200 years from now, how they'd be perceived. This telephone is made up of much more complex planes and shapes and color, and I just wonder if it ends up being more personal. I mentioned to you before that this particular phone that's from the photograph is not a phone that I have. It's I didn't take this photograph, but my wife and I actually do have this cherry red phone at home as our landline. And before it was ours, it was my grandfather's, and it was in his barber shop from the time I was born, probably before that, and as long as he had the shop. So when you try to connect yourself with your subject matter and find an appreciation for it and meaning, that's the first step. Because if you can't find a meaning and appreciation and a beauty in what you're trying to create, then there's little chance that the audience will be able to connect with it or find meaning and emotion in it. The last stage here is the hook, and the hook of the phone has three very distinct planes of light, middle, and shadow, and I want to capture that. Eventually, on our next demo for layer 3, we're going to introduce a color that is not the local color of the telephone. To this extent, layer 1 and layer 2 have been done with only red. Red isn't just red. It's influenced by lighting and by temperature. And layer 3 is going to take our local color phones and apply more complex lighting and temperature to them. So the lower layers of 1 and 2 are still going to permeate through and influence what comes next. And part of that process has to be by preserving what is underneath. So even if you think in terms symbolically, preserving history, quite literally here, where we're documenting a phone of days gone by, you have to, in your layering process, preserve evidence of layer 1, layer 2, so that layer 3 eventually doesn't cover them up. So it's all about maintaining the luminosity of the page. Lest we forget the dial here, going back into to add some pigment in on the dial. And otherwise, that is where I'll leave you for today. In our next demo, we'll deal with layer 3.
If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email. And in the meantime, please continue to practice social distancing, wash your hands, and wear a mask.